Hi, in this video we're going to cover sea and air freight and when it makes sense to use one over the other and some of the differences between the two. Just to give you a general idea, air tends to be much faster than sea freight shipping, but tends to be a lot more expensive for the same quantity, weight and volume of products. But this really does depend on the specific details of your shipment, the size of the cartons, the quantity, the value of the shipment, because it can vary hugely at different times of the year. The price for air and sea freight can change a lot. For different sizes and weights of product, the cost via air and sea can fluctuate a lot. So for one item, the difference between air and sea might be a huge difference. For another, it may turn out that air is much cheaper than sea. I used to ship screen protectors. So you could fit 1,000 screen protectors or more into a single carton. So sending 5 cartons turned out to be much cheaper to send by air than by sea, because just 5 cartons is not much volume, not much weight when you're sending by air freight. So even though the cost per pound or per kilogram is high, because it didn't take up much space per product, the price overall for the total wasn't so expensive. Let's say it was $500, but if I was to send that by sea, the origin trucking, the destination trucking, the handling fees, the container fees would be maybe $1,500 as a minimum. And so it was much cheaper to send by air in the case of that product. But other items which were bigger and bulkier, sea tended to be much cheaper overall. So the very best thing to do is to ask your supplier, your factory, to get you a air freight price and a sea freight price, and also to do a bit of research yourself online. Contact a freight forwarder. Try to find a freight forwarder that maybe has an office near you. That's probably the best, because then you can have good communication with them, and also get them to give you a quote for air freight and sea freight, because the price between different providers and different times of year, different shipments varies massively. There's no fixed way of knowing the exact cost at any one time, because there's so many variables. And with air freight, the rates can go up and down quite rapidly. Sea freight changes month to month, sometimes weekly, depending on the season. Peak season being the lead up to Christmas, the prices increase. There's additional charges per container. But other times of the year, there can be surcharges if it's suddenly busy. You never know. So it's best to get prices from 2 or 3 different providers for both air and sea each time, and just compare at the time, once you know the exact details of your shipment, from these different providers, and just see which one is the most economical for you. What I usually recommend is to move things along faster, is maybe to send 30 or 40% of your products by air, so they're in stock, they're in the warehouse, and the balance is following up 40 days later or so by sea, and then to allow enough time between reorders that you can send the goods by the cheapest shipping method, usually sea, once you're talking 2, 3, 4,000 units a time. So allow 45 days within your reorder and restocking cycle to send it by sea, so your per unit price is much lower. But that's something you would do later in the process. Initially, you want to get the goods in as quickly as possible, get your listing up, start selling, and then take it from there. Another strategy to use is potentially to always hold 2 or 3 or 400 units at the factory, so that if you need to rush some in by air, you can, while the next order is being made, and then that's going by sea. If you always got a couple of hundred units ready and available, if there's any delay for the sea for whatever reason, you can always just air freight some goods in to prevent you going out of stock as well. So different strategies for using air and sea there. What we're going to do is just go into some of the details between the differences of how cost is calculated, so you get more of an understanding. With air freight, the final weight or charge is based upon, it may be, let's say the cost is $5 a pound. The the air freight company is going to use the higher of the weight of the box and the volumetric weight. So let's say, for example, you're sending 100 cartons, each one weighs 40 pounds, so the total is 4,000 pounds, but the box size is 20 inches by 20 by 20, so the volumetric weight is actually 58 pounds per box. So even though the box itself weighs 40 pounds, the length times width times height is divided by 5,000 to get the volumetric weight, which in this case is 58. So your 100 cartons would be classified as 58 pounds each, so 5,800 instead of 4,000 pounds. And then that would times by whatever the price is per pound in your case, so $5 a pound. And that's how the air freight cost would be calculated. So if you have a very light item but it's bulky, maybe the item only weighs a pound but takes up a large volume, sending by air might be very, very expensive because the weight is calculated by the larger of the weight and the volume. Similarly, if the item is very heavy but doesn't take up much space at all, air freight might be quite economical because the overall size and weight of the shipment is relatively low. For example, in the example I gave you, the screen protectors I was sending, they're both light and they take up hardly any volume whatsoever, even packaged. And so overall air freight was actually really, really cheap, cents per item to send that particular item. But if the item weighs a pound and is about the size of a shoebox, sending by air is going to cost you a fortune. It's much, much cheaper to send by sea. Sea freight in comparison, usually the price is calculated on the volume of goods, so the CBM, the cubic meters, and so you're timesing again the weight, the width by the height by the length, but you're not then dividing by 5,000 as you are in this case. So your goods will either fill a container, so you might fill a 20-foot container, and so you have there's two main types of sea freight prices. So it's full container load, where you're filling a 20-foot or a 40-foot or a 40-foot high cube container, or a loose container load, where your shipment doesn't fill a container and is being sent separately. And the way the pricing is calculated and structured is quite different between the two. The cost difference between a 40-foot container, which is 40 foot in length, versus a 20-foot container, the 20-foot container might be $2,800 to send port to port, but the 40-foot container might be $3,000 to send port to port. So there can sometimes be a very small difference, or not much difference, even though you're getting to send a huge volume more of goods, double in some cases. The exact size of a 40-foot container is not quite double a 20-foot container because of this ending. So if you attach two together, there's actually a bit more space in a 40-foot if you don't have the wall in the middle. And there's something called a 40-foot HQ container, which is just high cubed, which is just a bit taller than a regular container, so again giving you more volume. Sometimes the price difference between the 40-foot container and the 40-foot high cube might be only $50 port to port, and so you might be getting a few thousand more units squeezed in for a very reasonable amount extra. So with sea freight, if you're filling a container, usually there's a per container rate, and the trucking cost from the factory to the port, the port to port rate, and the final destination port to your warehouse will all be based on a per container rate, which may be, say, $3,000 per container, with trucking each end $500 to $800 per container. And so then the overall fixed cost of filling that container. It's just down to you to calculate how many units you can squeeze into there in your packaging, and then how much that is going to cost you per unit to send. That's why it's very important to try to keep packaging as small and minimal as possible while still looking nice, because it reduces the overall cost of your freight and shipping. If you're sending by loose container load, loose container shipment, so you may be sending goods, 10 goods, then usually the way it's calculated is there's a fixed price from one port to another for a certain volume of goods. It's CBM is the normal price, cubic meter, and really this is only cost effective when you're sending around 10 cubic meters of product by sea. Below that it can get quite expensive because there's charges for the factory to the port, trucking costs, there's fixed costs for the delivery from the destination port to your warehouse as well, whether that's Amazon or your own warehouse or your home if you're inspecting the goods. So with air and sea freight, for both of them, there's a lot of additional costs which are very hard to judge before you ship. For example, there may be, depending on your freight forwarder, 4 to 10 different fees at the origin port, such as truck loading fees, terminal handling fees, per shipment fees charged by different parties along the supply chain. For example, the port may charge fees, the truck company may charge additional fees. So if you get a quote from a sea freight or air freight provider and your factory for both, what you'll find is that there'll be certain costs indicated, but they will also state that additional costs or unforeseen costs are charged to you as well. So even though they're telling you it's going to cost you about $2,000 to ship this from your factory in Shenzhen to your Amazon warehouse, for example, it may end up costing you $3,000 by the time all of the charges are built into there. So really you want to allow at least 30 to 50% on top of what you're quoted for all of these additional charges. I know it seems crazy that it's like that, but there's so many factors involved in calculating the cost of sea and air freight on your particular shipment that they're never certain exactly what the cost is going to be. And then in addition to that, you have to watch out for the customs duties and taxes as you're bringing the goods in. And if you've got certain types of cargo, you need to watch out for any restrictions on shipping that cargo. Lithium batteries, for example, many providers of air freight won't take lithium batteries. Certain sea freight companies won't take lithium batteries. You need to check before you even order the product. What you want to do is get the size of the cartons from the factory, get the size of the exact final. If you're ordering 1,000 units, what's the volume of that going to be? And at that stage, before placing the order, check the sea freight costs and the air freight costs, and if there's any restrictions on your type of product. Calculate up front how much it's going to cost, and does the landed price still make sense? Landed prices at the final delivery destination, the cost of the product plus all of the freight, handling, duties, taxes. Calculate all of that up front and check whether it still makes sense. So even though the general rule of thumb is air is much more expensive than sea, you don't know for any particular shipment and any particular date what it's going to be. So just check in advance of placing the order, what's the sea freight price for this size shipment, what's the air freight price for this size shipment. Double check with at least 2 or 3 different providers, including asking your factory to quote the cost as well, what the duties are going to be, are there any restrictions. Do the homework in advance of placing your first order, and know that in between orders, the price for sea and air freight may fluctuate 30 or 40% up and down. If your first order is, say, March, and then your reorder is leaving in October, the cost of freight may have increased massively because it's now peak season. Everyone's rushing in to deliver. There may be delays at the port. There may be surcharges of $1,000 or more per container from the sea freight companies. So with all of with everything to do with the freight, you want to do your homework before placing the order, because that would stop any surprises. And the other thing you want to do is to check that your factory has exported that type of product before to your market. So if you're selling in the US, has that factory shipped this product to the US before? Is there any special paperwork that I need in place? Ask the factory. You may need to have certain test certificates. You may need to have a certain license to deal in that particular product. Again, all of this should be done before ever placing the order. So simulate doing a real shipment. Get the if you plan to order 500 units from the factory, get the exact carton size. Go to some freight forwarders locally that you find on Google in your area and get them to quote the price. Tell them you're shipping in a week's time, because otherwise, if you're shipping 3 months out, they're not going to quote for you because they're not sure what the price is going to be 3 months out. So just tell them it's, okay, I'm shipping next week. Can I have an air freight and a sea freight price? When they come back to you, just ask them, do you know what the duties are going to be for this? How can I check? There's different web services where you can check the duties as well, and that's something you need to Google for your particular product. But do all of this homework before placing that PO. The worst thing is to have shipped 2,000 units or 1,000 units from China and then found that once it arrives in the US, you don't have the right paperwork for it, and there's huge fees to either send it back or to amend the product, add some sort of label, such as it needs a made in China label. That made in China label pretty much needs to be on all items, but there could be other markings and requirement for your particular product that you need to find out well before placing your first order.